And he is best known for the social brain hypothesis, the gossip theory of language evolution, and the Dunbar's number with his name on it, that is the limit on the number of relationships that we can manage. Currently, he is developing very interesting projects related to the mechanisms of social cohesion. And I think this is very interesting in the times we are going through, especially. And he's also author of many popular science books that cover this very interesting research, where I'm sure are really putting together what we want indeed with this event, which is high top science, but something that also is of interest in this case for all of us, and in particular in the times where we're going through and when we really want to wonder or interrogate ourselves about what is the nature of human evolution and which things in this world and this cohesion and this relationship may have helped us to go through to the difficult times. So, well, I just want to really give the voice to Professor Dunbar. He's gonna give a talk with a very attractive and interesting title, is A Brain for All Seasons, the challenges that determine human evolution, and with a very appealing question, you know, have you ever thought that it was time, not really food, what was really constraining on our evolution? So Professor Dunbar, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And please, the time and the CENIEH doors are virtually, but also physically open when the situation allows for that. And welcome to the CENIEH family. So this is your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry not to be there in person, of course, but let's hope we can do that at some point in the future. Now I'm going to talk about really some of the major challenges as I see them during the course of human evolution that have set us on the pathway that our species has eventually been the end point of, if you like. I might just add a note of caution at the beginning. Of course, I'm not a paleontologist. I'm not a fossils person at all. I'm really an ecologist, an evolutionary ecologist, and a neuropsychologist as much as anything else, which has advantages, because it means if I'm speaking to proper fossil people, proper human anatomists and paleoanthropologists, I can always say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'm just an ignorant psychologist. I don't really understand these details. And if I'm equally talking to psychologists, I can say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'm just an ignorant biological anthropologist. I don't understand these subtleties of psychology. And this allows me to sort of cover all these disciplines, really, which has been very entertaining and great fun, I think, in the course of my scientific career. Okay, so let me bring up my slides at this point, if I can, and we'll get going on the talk itself. So there's the title, as Maria said. Really think about the kinds of things that people have always focused on in the course of studying human evolution. And basically, it's been the materials that we have available there in the ground. And these, of course, are predominantly the bones and the stones, the tools and the artifacts that people in the past have made. And if we think about the behavior that's associated with this at all, it tends to be in a kind of, well, let's say a cartoon kind of way, often probably not very realistic, and a lot of artistic license. They're very nice pictures that artists have prepared for us over the years, but how realistic they are, of course, is another question. And I think this has therefore made paleoanthropologists very nervous about discussing things that we can't see in the ground. We can't see the hard evidence for, if you like. But I think actually we can do better now, but only if we exploit really our much improved understanding of primate behavioral ecology in particular, and I suppose some of the neuropsychology that's now coming through. And I want to talk about three particular things: the importance of brains in the course of human evolution, the importance of temperature, and the importance of time. I'll talk about each of these in turn. So the place to start really is the brains, because the one thing that is very characteristic of human evolution, above all else, I would say, is this dramatic increase in brain size that's occurred over the course of the last 5 or 6 million years of human evolution. We tend to see, or there is a tendency to see this as a sort of continuous upswing of increasing brain size. But in fact, if you look at it more carefully and separate out the different species groups, it's very clear that there are kind of jumps up, as it were. There are long periods of stability, and then you have a sudden jump in brain size. There are three main ones, at least there are three main ones I want to concentrate on. There's this one early on with the appearance of Homo, where brain size increases very dramatically about 2 million years ago. There's another one that occurs with the appearance of archaic humans here, the Heidelberg folk and the Neanderthals, round about perhaps 600,000, 500,000 years ago. And then finally is this last final jump with the appearance of anatomically modern humans at about 250,000 years ago. And when you get jumps like this is very suspicious of the possibility that you have here what I always call glass ceilings. There's a point beyond which evolution can't move, can't increase brain size, or whatever it may be. And then something breaks through the glass ceiling. The species change their physiology or their ecology or some aspect of how they function, and it allows them then to evolve to a next higher limit, as it were. But you know, real life, as well as the real world of ecology, is always full of these limits. Very often they're things like energy, or as I shall argue, time is another one. And these set limits beyond which species cannot evolve further unless they undertake some major change of how they're built, if you like. Okay, so what's going on in here? What's going on in here, I think, is the social brain. The social brain is an explanation that was suggested about 25, 30 years ago now for why primates have such big brains compared to all other species of animals. And the argument is it's because they live in very complicated, complex, large social groups that require a big computer to manage those. Now, there's been a tendency over the years for people just to, so these are data on group size here on a log scale against a measure of brain size. It doesn't really matter in many ways which one you put in here, you get much the same picture. And each of these is actually one genus of primates. And there's a tendency for people to just stick a regression line through that. And of course, you get a significant correlation in most cases. And then to plug humans into that regression line, you get a value that's somewhere down here, usually around about 100. Now, the problem with doing that is actually you're committing what's known as the ecological fallacy, because whenever you get grades in data, and there are very clear grades, which we've now finally been able to show here. In fact, there are 4 grades in this primate data set relating group size to brain size. Whenever you put a regression line, an ordinary regression line through that, you commit the ecological fallacy, and it always lowers the slope. In fact, what we want is the ape line, because that's the group we belong to, the family we belong to. And when you plug in the value for human neocortex ratio, human brain size, what you get is this predicted value of 150 that's now known as Dunbar's number. And that's very, very consistently so. So, you know, one has to be very careful how one does one's statistical analyses here. And I pointed this out 30 years ago, in fact. And ever since then, I've always used the ape line, but for some reason, everybody else wants to put a general regression through these data. Now, the number 150, which often surprises people that human group sizes could be so small, in fact, turns out to be very, very consistent. We've looked at, I think there's about 30 different studies now have attempted to estimate natural human group sizes in various ways: face-to-face personal networks, cell phone calling data, you know, how many people you call, different people you call in the year, number of friends on Facebook. I think the prize for the biggest study goes to one study just about 10 years ago, which looked at 64 million Facebook pages. I hasten to say their average number of friends on Facebook for these 64 million users was exactly 149. So I rest my case. This number is real. But other people have looked at the size of English villages and Italian alpine villages over 800-year periods, and you see exactly the same value. Consistently, human village sizes in traditional societies, hunter-gatherer community sizes are always around about 150, or let's say somewhere between 100 and 200. The robustness of this relationship is very comforting, because it means we can use it to predict backwards in time to fossil species and get an idea, at least a ballpark idea, of how big the community sizes, the natural community sizes for these extinct fossil species might be. And we're very lucky, I think, with the human lineage in particular, because we know they must sit on the ape line. We can't necessarily do this with other species of monkeys, because they might be on the other grades, and we don't know which grade to put them on necessarily. But we know that the hominin, anything in the hominin lineage must sit on the ape line here. And that ape line, for these purposes, is anchored between the chimpanzees here and modern humans. All hominin species have to sit on this section of the line. They can't be anywhere else, unless you want to argue that somewhere between our separation from the African great apes and our arrival as modern humans, fossil hominins have been doing something completely different to all other species of primates, including modern humans. So this doesn't make any sense. This is completely illogical. So we can be fairly sure that all fossil species have to lie on the line here. And that allows us then to estimate what community sizes would have looked like. And here they are. These are our estimates for individual populations of fossils based on the crania. So we're taking the crania, estimating in fact, neocortex ratio from the crania, and estimating community size from that. And this is the picture you get. Here are all the Australopithecines down here. And in fact, actually, habilis would now be considered a Australopithecine, and rudolfensis would really be considered a very early Homo. So these 2 points perhaps should be reversed. But the key picture here is the Australopithecines are sitting very comfortably on this line. They don't deviate much from it. It's below the value of about 50, which seems to be the upper limit for all primates. No species of monkey and ape lives in average group sizes that are bigger than 50. But then, of course, it takes off as brain size increases, going up through early Homo, the archaics here, up to anatomically. These are fossil anatomically modern humans. You can see they're sitting perfectly on the modern human line. Now, those of you who are professional paleoanthropologists will immediately notice there's somebody missing from this, the Neanderthals. What's happened to the Neanderthals? Well, let me show you the problem here. The problem is really this map here, and it has to do with the tropics. Remember, all primates, living primates, and most of the fossil hominins all lived within the tropics. Of course, Erectus got out into Eurasia and so on. But the particularly problematic one in this context is the Neanderthals, because the Neanderthals lived up there and they never came anywhere near the tropics. So here's the limit of the tropics here on this line. The Neanderthals, you can see, are based entirely in Europe and Western Asia and the Near East here. And the problem with the tropics is, as you go, or with the world, if you like, is as you go out of the tropics, so light levels decline dramatically. And of course, it becomes much more seasonal. In winter, you have these long, dark winters, which in Spain, you're not so familiar with. But believe me, up in Northern Europe, we are very familiar with these long, dark winter nights. And this is reducing light levels for the detection of anything, whether it's prey or predators or whatever out there in the environment, very considerably. And as a result of that, I'm going to argue here, we get these distinctive features for the Neanderthals. And here they are, the three key features. These very, very big eyes compared to the eyes of modern humans. This much flatter head, suggesting that there's much less forebrain material compared with modern humans. And last but not least, this classic Neanderthal bun, this extension of the brain at the back, whereas in our modern humans, our head is much more rounded at the back and lacks this bun. So the question is the Neanderthal bun and their big eyes two characteristic features of this whole family, part of a visual adaptation to light low levels living at very high latitudes in Eurasia. And here's the explanation for this. So we've looked at cranial volumes in museum specimens of modern humans. So these are people who lived 200 to 300 years ago. So they're perfectly modern, but there they are. So these are cranial volumes. And if you plot cranial volume against latitude, what you get is really this quite nice relationship. Cranial volumes increase with latitude, and so do orbit volumes. That's, say, the size of the volume of the eye socket. Again, for these same specimens, eye sockets get bigger and bigger and bigger. So they're if you like, the lens on the front of the camera is getting bigger and bigger and bigger to let more light in. And this is true of modern humans. So these are data from contemporary humans. It's neuroimaging data, brain scanning data, in which they're looking at mean eyeball volume plotted against the size of the visual cortex. And the visual cortex, or the primary visual cortex, is all at the back of the brain, and that's the key to this. And we find exactly the same picture here in primates, that in primates, the size of the visual cortex at the back of the brain is correlated with the size of the eyeball. Now, the visual system is very extended and complex. The main processing area is the back of the brain, but there's a kind of series of brain regions that go up towards the front, and eventually, of course, they're processed right at the front of the brain. But the key visual processing areas is this long series of layers that go up, and they're all highly correlated in size. So you've got something that produces a kind of linear sequence of tightly correlated volumes, the size of the eyeball, the size of the various visual connections between the eyeball and the back of the brain, the size of this big area V1 at the back of the brain, then the subsidiary areas going forwards into the middle part of the brain. And that this seems to increase as we go higher and higher in latitude, or populations go higher and higher in latitude, and that causes them to have a bigger brain. Doesn't mean to say they're smarter, it's just they've got a bigger brain because they have a bigger visual area. And that's why we Northern Hemisphere people from Europe and so on have to wear sunglasses when we go to the tropics, because we just get blinded by the amount of sunlight that's coming in. So we go back to the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals basically had very similar brain sizes to anatomically modern humans, but they had this much bigger visual system here at the back. And so if they have more neural material in the back here, then they must have less at the front if they're going to have the same total brain size. And that really is the key to the issue, because it's the frontal lobe here, this in particular prefrontal cortex, that is heavily important in determining the size of group you actually live in. And we know this from neuroimaging studies of humans, that the size of your personal social circle, your personal social network as an individual, is correlated with the size of the key units in your prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobe and parietal cortex behind it. But there's a huge, massive kind of neural system linked by very, very big wiring connection that is primarily solely concerned with managing your relationships. Okay, so if we take this on board and we adjust brain sizes to estimate true frontal lobe volume for the various archaic human and Neanderthal and anatomically modern human fossils, this is the picture we get in terms of community size. We have early on, even in early anatomically modern humans, we have group sizes which are somewhere down here, around about perhaps 110, 120. And it's really something happens when anatomically modern humans really get going, that increases brain size and results in these much bigger groups at 150. The Neanderthals through that period are remaining pretty much in the same area as they always have been. So why is time important? The second big question I want to talk about. Time really is much, much more important for animals than we have imagined in the past. We tend to assume that the limits on whether animals can live in a place is determined by the quality of food they have to eat and how much food they get. The answer is, well, yes, it does, but the real constraint is imposed by time. No matter how poor the environment, if you had infinite time, you could live there because you could eat enough to get even very small quantities of nutrients out of each mouthful to survive. The problem is that we all have to contend with what's sometimes called physiological time, that our bodies need a certain amount of food every day. And that limitation is what the problem is. So ultimately, it's a question of how much time you can devote to feeding, to acquiring food, that's critical. Now, what we've spent a lot of the last 20 years really doing is building quite complex, but conceptually very simple models of the time budgets of monkeys and indeed one ungulate, the feral goats, to look at how time budgets, the amount of time you have to spend feeding and moving and so on, is affected by local environmental conditions, and then what the consequences of that are for the size of groups you live in. So here are 4 key time budget components: feeding, moving, resting time that's forced on us by the environment, where we have to go and take shelter under in the shade because it gets too hot. This is something you are very, very familiar with in Spain. It's called a siesta. And that the amount of, even in Spain, we've shown that the amount of siesta time depends on the temperature of the environment at different latitudes in Spain. So people in the south of Spain have much longer siestas in the middle of the day than people in the north of Spain, and it correlates beautifully with the difference in average temperature in the summer in particular. So there is this component of forced resting time, which you have to have because it's just too hot out in the sun to do anything. And then finally, peculiar to primates is this requirement for social time. And social time is the time required for social bonding, to keep these very complex bonded social groups that primates have. They're unique, pretty much unique in the animal kingdom. There are a few other groups of like horses and the dolphins that have similar kinds of bonded social systems, but they're extremely rare outside the primates. And the logic of these models is that climatic variables acting through vegetation and so on determine how much feeding and moving you have to do. That's the energy cost of survival. And then whatever time is left over after you've added in resting time is the amount of time that's free here for you to devote to social activity. And that in turn determines the size of community you can live in. That's the bonding cost. And it's these two costs of survival that I wanted to particularly talk about. Now, we've done these for a very wide range, all the apes, and a lot of the main old world monkey and some South American monkey genera. We've done them for one ungulate, as I mentioned, the feral goats, and we've done them for Australopithecines. And we've been in the process of trying to generalize these to later Homo populations as well. But these models are population specific. They're not species specific. Well, they're genus specific in the sense that a genus has a particular physiological style, if you like. It's either a folivore or a frugivore or a carnivore, for example, and that affects the time it has to spend feeding and moving. But the actual models are built on what individual populations do, and therefore they allow us to predict exactly what individual populations do. And the key to it, though, is this relationship between social time and group size. And social time for primates means social grooming, this kind of stuff here. And there is a very robust relationship between the size of social group that species live in and the amount of time they have to devote to social grooming. It's a very time-consuming business when you live in very, very big groups. But it works. We understand now how it works. It works through the endorphin system in the brain, which produces this sense of warmth and coziness and all's well with the world and with the people you're doing this activity with. We know that's what happens in primates. The endorphin grooming triggers the endorphin system. And with my collaborators in Finland, we ran some neuroimaging studies in which people were put in brain scanners while they were being stroked on the chest and the stomach. And here's their brain just firing up within the endorphin receptors, firing up, receiving endorphins from the brain as a result of being stroked in this way. So this is why we all go around hugging each other, and this is why lockdown is such a disconcerting business, because we can't go and hug each other and stroke each other in the way which we used to do beforehand. That's very frustrating for us. So now we can use these ideas to look at the Australopithecine time budgets. We actually used it, the chimpanzee, or the pan chimpanzee time budget model and the baboon time budget model to predict where species might have occurred with the kind of paleoclimates that we had in the past, where the Australopithecines might have occurred. And we're looking for a time budget model that predicts exactly where, correctly predicts where Australopithecine lived and where they didn't live. That's our kind of criterion for all these time budget models. And then we can kind of play with these two models as the outer limits, if you like, to try and find some model in the middle that exactly predicts what the Australopithecines did. Now, here's a key example, really. This is the chimpanzee model. The black dots are places that the chimpanzee model says chimpanzees can live there under present climatic conditions. The white dots are places where the model says they couldn't possibly live. And you can see, all down in here, it's all white dots. Up in here is black dots, so chimpanzees can live here. There's a gap in the middle where it's mainly white dots, which is the Dahomey Gap, and indeed there are no chimpanzees there. So what you have, this maps very nicely onto the current range for chimpanzees in particular, Western chimpanzees here, the Central African and East African chimpanzees here, separated by the Dahomey Gap in the middle. But just look at where the Australopithecines live. Here's the Australopithecine corridor, as it sometimes occurred, where all the fossil sites for Australopithecines occur. Chimpanzees simply couldn't live there. It would simply be impossible. And the baboon model, by contrast, the baboon model would have Australopithecines living in this corridor, but they'd also have them living in all these areas over here where they, as far as we know, they didn't. So we have to find some mix between these two models, if you like, that causes black points to be in this band here and everywhere else to be white points where the species couldn't have lived. But the reason why the chimpanzees live here and cannot live in these areas is mainly the costs of travel. And the costs of travel here, this is time has to be devoted to moving as a function of the size of the foraging party and the rainfall, which is the main driver in this particular case. You can see that foraging time, travel time, not even foraging time, just travel time, escalates and goes through the roof. It reaches 100% when foraging party size is only 20. And remember, the average size for chimpanzee communities is somewhere around 45 to 50. And particularly so when it gets dry. Remember, all these habitats up here are quite dry habitats compared with the forested habitats of chimpanzees. So somehow, clearly, Australopithecines had to solve the foraging time before they could even live. So here's our estimate of the time budget and its main components for all the Australopithecines going up. And pretty much there's two interesting things here. They don't vary very much across the whole range of the Australopithecines. And secondarily, here's 100%. That's 100% of the day. There is no more time available in the day. It's they're right at the limits. They have no spare capacity in there at all. And so if we extend this then up to the early and later Homo species through time, and we've only changed two things here, feeding time and social time. These have been kept constant. Feeding time reflects increasing body size on the one hand and increasing brain size at a much higher energetic requirement. And then social time is just reflecting group size. What we find is time budgets increase dramatically. And the big change is really social time, much more so than the energy requirements that they needed. Actually, didn't need all that much more energy, but the social time to keep these very big groups together just pushed them through the roof. These late species, archaic humans and anatomically modern humans, are having to spend half as much again of their time doing these activities than is actually available to them in a 12-hour day. And remember, all primates are diurnal. They sleep at night. They don't do anything at night. It all has to be done in the 12 hours of the day. So the question is, how did we solve that problem? Here's the big problem. Here's the limit that primates actually spend grooming, 20% of the day. Here's the amount of time that anatomically modern humans, and indeed modern humans, would have to spend grooming, about 45% of the day. It's this gap here. And what we think has happened is that we've introduced these ways of enhancing bonding or using time more efficiently by grooming, in effect, with many individuals simultaneously. Laughter, which almost certainly came in very early on, is very ancient because we share it with great apes. Singing and dancing, singing without words. And when language comes in, the rituals of religion, storytelling, feasting, and so on, we think they came in at these individual points. But what's important about all of these is they trigger the endorphin system, and they allow the endorphin system to be triggered with several people individually, which is not possible for grooming. You can only groom one individual at a time. We've shown that laughter does this using PET scanning, brain scanning. Here's the results from one of our studies showing that when you laugh, your brain is flooded with endorphins. We've done other kinds of study checking using the pain threshold as a proxy for endorphin activation with singing and dancing, religious rituals, feasting, storytelling, and they all show these same effects. And we can show that all of them also increase the sense of bonding with the social group. So this actually brings us neatly around to the question of why temperature becomes important, aside from temperature affecting the quality of the habitat. But the issue really goes back to Peter Wheeler's model, I think, which he suggested in the 1980s, that hominins stood upright, our ancestors stood upright and walked bipedally because it exposed less of the body surface to the sun during the middle of the day. So here's the amount of incident radiation, sunlight on the body surface as a whole, as a result of either being quadrupedal, and it's very high across the middle of the day, whereas if you stand vertically, bipedally like this, then your only the top of your head and your shoulders is exposed to sun, and this produces this big dip here at the time of the day when the sun is hottest, and that's very important. Now, there have been some claims since then that this model doesn't actually work. Graham Ruxton and Wilkinson introduced a correction because they said that Wheeler had forgotten the heat created by travel, by the body muscles moving, and if you introduce that, it wiped out the effect. Now, the problem with their analysis, which is perfectly sensible, is that they assume that primates in general travel throughout the day, and the answer is no, they don't. They travel mostly in the morning or the evening when it's cooler, and they rest during the day when it's hot. And they assume that the Australopithecines lived at sea level. And the answer is they didn't. If you look at the altitudes at which the Australopithecine sites occur in both East Africa and South Africa, and these are corrected for the fact that the Rift Valley has dropped dramatically in altitude over the last 3 to 4 million years. So if you look at the altitude as it was back in the time of the Australopithecines, these species were very high level species. They lived above 1,000 meters. And the same is true of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees don't really live below 500 meters in altitude. And if you look at the temperature, this really makes the point, I think, very nicely. If you looked at the average temperature for these habitats and for modern day chimpanzee habitats, they're around about 25, whereas Ruxton and Wilson assume in their model that it's somewhere about 32, 33 degrees centigrade. In other words, the temperature at sea level, whereas these species are living at high altitudes where it's much cooler. And so what then happens if you take the Ruxton and Wilkinson model, neither quadrupedal nor bipedal species can live anywhere because here's the thermal limit that they can cope with. And you can see the estimates of their actual thermal production, how much heat they're absorbing and creating and so on, is much, much higher. Whereas if they're hairless, then they can just about cope. Whereas if you correct for resting during the middle of the day and the lower temperatures at higher altitudes, actually even hair-covered Australopithecines could have survived quite happily in much, much better condition. However, what this kind of forgets, or what the third thing that most of the models have forgotten, is that night times are very cold at these altitudes. So during the early morning and during the evening, through the course of the night, the energy loss would be huge because it's so cold in these habitats. And in fact, calculating the energy required to sustain body temperature for Australopithecine populations in these habitats, these are 3 different habitats at 3 different altitudes, they would need to spend 3 times more, or need to eat 3 times more to get enough energy to stay alive. So basically, if you have Ruxton and Wilkinson Australopithecines, they would have frozen to death at night because they had no hair cover. But if these are hairless Australopithecines, if you like, whereas furred Australopithecines would have been just above the minimum thermal level to stay alive for both males and females. So whatever happens, it seems the Australopithecines must have been furred. They were not ecological apes. They could not live at sea level, which explains something which nobody ever comments on, I think, and that is why the Australopithecines never left Africa. The answer is they couldn't. They couldn't get low enough to get across the sea level bridges in the north. But with the big climatic event when temperatures were lowered around 2.5 million years ago, which corresponds to the appearance of anatomically modern humans, then they could get down below sea level or get down to sea level, and particularly so if they lost their fur cover and could use sweating to cool by evaporation, which is, of course, Wheeler's secondary model. But that created another problem for them, of course, that they couldn't survive at high latitudes in the cold of the night. So this is where fire then becomes crucial to them. Now, there is another reason why fire is interesting in this context, because fire extends daylight for about 3 to 4 hours. If you remember the time budget story, all the Homo species would have been exceeding their time budget capacity. They would have needed much more time than they had available. So a crucial solution to that, and particularly for the later archaic and modern humans, where they have a very, very big difference between time requirement and time available, extending daylight into the night by 3 to 4 hours, as we still do, gives you an extra 3 to 4 hours in the day. And if you put all your social activity into the night, then you have the day in which to do your ecological activities, if you like. Now, the problem with the dark is, or with the nighttime and fires, is that it's too dark to do things like fine needlework or anything like that by the flickering light of the fire. You can't usefully gesture across it. Much the best way of communicating is clearly vocal exchanges. So language at that point really becomes important, because it allows you to spend all that time talking and telling stories. And here's some data from hunter-gatherers showing that at nighttime, most of their conversations are related to social things and to joking and things like that, whereas in the daytime, most of their conversations are related to factual and economic activity. And that ability to tell the folk tales of our culture, as it were, becomes very important in this context, because that's one of the key mechanisms whereby we create not only friendships, but also bond social communities. And so this gives us perhaps a handle on when language evolved. So if we estimate the grooming time required from group size for all the fossil hominins, this is the picture it looks like. Here are macaques, monkeys, and chimpanzees as a great ape, just over here to kind of give you the benchmark. But you can see really from the appearance of Homo here, it starts to lift above this 20% limit that you have in primates in general and rise very, very steeply. And I've tracked down in the end about 7 anatomical indices of, let's say, breath control and speech management, not necessarily language, but the capacity to speak and to control breath, because this might be singing rather than language as we know it. And all of these show primate-like patterns in early Homo and modern human-like patterns from the appearance of the Heidelberg's archaic humans around 500,000 years ago. So there's a very dramatic switch here, just at the time at which there is a really big increase in the amount of grooming time that's required. And it's very around this time that you see control over fire. You suddenly start to see hearths or evidence for hearths in almost all fossil sites, fossil hominin sites. Whereas before this date, very occasionally and questionably, you find the odd hearth here and there. But what's always important is not the earliest evidence for fire, but when fire becomes common, or fire use becomes common. Question then is, though, is this language as we know it? Language as we know it is dependent on mentalizing. Mentalizing is this ability to understand what somebody else is thinking and intending to do, and is crucial in conversations, because when you're talking to me, I have to try and figure out what it is that you mean, because words are not actually very sophisticated. They're quite crude. Sometimes the sounds are used to mean several different things. So we have, well, certainly in English, you have things like, usually, of course, we spell them differently, but they are pronounced the same. So a word like pear, meaning two, or a pear, meaning the fruit, or to pare something, meaning to cut something down, all sound the same, but mean 3 completely different things. So I have to kind of figure out, when you're talking to me, which one of these do you mean? And try and think my way into your mind. This is what's known as mentalizing. It's a recursive phenomenon in which there are a series of levels of intentionality which we begin as children, very babies, with what's called first order intentionality, which we share with all mammals and birds, for sure. It's basically consciousness. Second order intentionality, which we acquire at the age of 5, when we realize that other people can think something and think something that's different to what we think. That's something we share with the great apes. And then after that, the successive layers beyond that, that we develop through childhood and teenagehood into adulthood, are peculiar to humans. And it seems that fifth order, so here's this diagram only shows up to third order. This boy thinks that this girl thinks that this boy thinks something. That's third order intentionality. Adult humans can do 5 orders of that. And the quality of our language is directly correlated with our individual skills on this. So this is data from one of our studies looking at how good individuals are at these kind of mentalizing tasks and how good they are unpacking syntax, unpacking sentences that consist of many different clauses. And you can see that the better you are on these mentalizing tasks, the more complex the sentences that you can unpack. Now, it turns out that these abilities are directly correlated with the size of our brains across primates, but also we've shown with neuroimaging studies, brain scanning studies, they correlate with the size of the key mentalizing circuit network in the brain in individuals. So we actually vary quite a bit in these mentalizing skills, and this correlates with the size of these areas in the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe in particular. But the fact that this relationship is so tight, so close to a linear relationship, means we can predict what the mentalizing capacities are for species of hominins, let's say, as a function of their frontal lobe volumes. And when we do that, this is what we get. And the important thing here, here's second order intentionality, which we share with great apes. You can see all the Australopithecines sit beautifully around that. Nothing very challenging for them there. This is what modern human adults can do, fifth order. And the big issue here is, if you look at what the Heidelbergs and the Neanderthals can do, they could only achieve fourth order intentionality. So they're a whole order down below us. Now that's important in terms of the quality of stories that they can tell, not only the quality of their relationships, that the number of relationships they can manage, because these are directly correlated, but also their ability to appreciate complex stories. And these are some of our data from looking at, in contemporary adult humans, people's ability to understand complex stories as a function of their mentalizing capacities, and in particular, people with poor mentalizing capacities find complex stories much more difficult, essentially, to deal with. And certainly, people with high mentalizing capacities find low mentalizing stories just boring, basically. And we see the same thing in jokes. So these are another study of ours where we've looked at the levels of intentionality in jokes. That's essentially the number of people involved in the story of the joke, as against the ratings of how good these are. The ratings increase dramatically the more different minds there are in the story, the funnier the story gets. But once you get above a certain level, sixth order intentionality here, bear in mind, fifth order is the limit for us, suddenly we don't understand the joke. It just becomes too complicated. So the important implication then for the Neanderthals, whose intellectual capabilities shouldn't be underestimated. They were very, very smart indeed. And not least the fact that they've long outlived us. They survived for much longer than we have as a species. So they clearly were very, very smart. But their language competences and their mentalizing competences were such that they could not have had fully modern language. They probably almost certainly had language, but it was more like the language of probably about 11, 12-year-old children. So it's quite good, but they're not going to be Einsteins, nowhere near. And in terms of their culture, what it means is their stories would not have been so imaginative, and their jokes wouldn't have been so funny, at least to us. They would have seemed like 11-year-olds jokes rather than adults jokes, if you like. So, you know, they're jokes, they're very clever, they're very amusing, but somehow in that sort of whole complex cultural world, they just wouldn't have been up to the same level of modern humans. And I'm suggesting here that that's part and parcel of the complex story of why they eventually went extinct under competition with the face of competition with modern humans. So just to sum up, a few points really to take away. Most of the archaeological models that we deal with and the explanations that we deal with really fail to take account of the behavioral aspects of ecology, and these are very important. It's behavior that determines what you can do. Time and not energy is limiting for most animals. Our time budget models are extremely good at predicting where primates can and cannot live, and even ungulates. Our goat model is very good. It can predict within 100 meters altitude where goats at these kind of high latitudes in the British Isles can live and cannot live. The social brain hypothesis gives us an extremely reliable guide to community sizes. Communities are very costly for primates to maintain because they depend on this time-costly process that underpins bonding. That's to say, in their case, grooming generically, but the mechanism involved is triggering the endorphin system. And although what's happened in the course of human evolution is we've found successively ways of triggering more and more endorphin activation, or at least triggering endorphin activation with more and more people simultaneously, which is what allowed us to increase group size. And that's been absolutely crucial. That's what gives these kind of glass ceiling effects predominantly. And that really, if you look back at the course of human evolution, back to our common ancestor, the great apes, and indeed, if you look back through primate social evolution, primate evolutionary history as general, what you see is these successive glass ceilings. And that's what those grades are that I mentioned right at the beginning in the social brain hypothesis data. Those grades are the very same kind of glass ceilings as I've been talking about in relation to hominin human evolution. And those glass ceilings are predominantly created by the way time budgets play out, and principally in the end, the costliness of social bonding. So on that happy note, I'm going to go back to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions from you.
So thank you so much, Professor, for this fascinating talk. I think you have touched many aspects we all feel involved in our the way we manage our time, the way we relate to each other, and of course you touch Neanderthals, with are always all paleontologists so sensitive about everything we said about Neanderthals. So yes, so please, I remind all of you that you have the chat open in the YouTube channel of CENIEH, so you can really make your questions to Professor Dunbar about, I think, many aspects that are of interest for all of us. And in the meantime, I, of course, have a lot of questions. I will share my time if necessary. It's about time also true, but while we wait for the audience questions, I have a few questions or curiosities to ask you, if I may. So I found very interesting, and then I wanted to ask you, when you were talking in this time budget and the way we manage time, no, this separation you were making between the feeding time and the social time. So if I understood correctly, in a way, the less time we need to really employ in this feeding, in this basically survival need, we can really devote more time to the social bonding, which is so important for maintaining these big groups. But especially based on your work, I remember now this beautiful paper of yours of breaking bread. I wonder where you put the boundary, especially I would say you were mentioning the Spaniards for the siesta, but I would say we should mention Spaniards for the sobremesa, which is a special thing we do after lunch. We keep talking very long time for lunch break and everything. Where you put the boundary indeed for our big meals that we socialize a lot, that we really spend a lot of time like eating in groups, indeed, which is so important for the socializing. How can you really put a boundary there? So how much we think indeed that we devote more time to eat and to lunch that is strictly necessary for survival, no? So I think this is where you put that line separating both.
Yep. So in reality, if you I suppose if you look at our own behavior, how much time do you need to eat the food you need to eat each day? We don't do what monkeys do, which is wander along picking berries here and there for quite a long day. Then they go to rest, and then when it's hot, and then when it's cooler again, they start. But they're kind of feeding continuously very often. And we don't do that. It's very conspicuous. No human society does that. They always have these kind of set meal times. When is important varies a little bit. In northern hemispheres, it tends to be lunchtime. In Spain, it's in the evening, probably. When it's cooler, of course. And I think this is also highlights a second feature then. So you've got these constrained times, but actually, if you think about the amount of time you need to eat that meal, it's really only about 15 or 20 minutes, okay? If you want, you can relax and eat it very slowly and so on. And we all do that, but we have this capacity, if we really want to, just to eat it, and that's finished with it. So the cooking takes, I don't know, maybe an hour, maybe less, depends how you cook, but to eat it, you can eat it all in 15 minutes. So why do we spend so much time then over our meals? And the answer is it's so we can talk. And I think in that context, it then becomes very conspicuous that we much prefer to do these kind of social things, including social eating, in the evening time. At lunchtime, we grab a sandwich and that's it. And maybe we say hello and we go back to our desks, or we work very hard, of course, especially in the institute. But when we kind of want to do a relaxed social eating, then we almost always do that in the evening. And it just strikes me that so many of these things we do socially, whether it's going to the theater or going to a music concert or having a party, any kind of party, going to dancing clubs, all these kind of things, it's much more magical when we do that in the evening in the dark than if we do it at lunchtime, okay? It's fun at lunchtime, but in the evening, in the dark, it is just magical. And the question is, why is that? And I think that's just a hangover from this early part of the archaic human period when we discovered how to control fire, and we use that to extend daylight. And the only thing you can do in then in the nighttime, because the lighting is poor from a fire, is talk to each other and kind of chew on your big leg of deer or whatever. But what then becomes important is creating this ambience, if you like, in which storytelling becomes more magical, which engaging with friends, talking to friends becomes more magical. Jokes are more funny, all these kind of things. So I think that's kind of just that hangover. It's so ancient, relatively speaking, that it's still part of our toolkit, if you like, of sociality. So I would put, yes, the Spanish siesta goes back a long way.
Okay. Yeah, and also this thing, devoting this time for talking while we eat and everything. Yeah. Okay, we like bonding, that's true. So that's part, is in our nature, we can say, right? So the other thing I wanted to ask you, I think it's very interesting when you were talking about like the equivalence of grooming, no? The grooming that humans do is a type of mass grooming. So we can groom more than one at a time, thanks to collective activities that you said, like singing, laughing, and everything. So I was thinking of the pandemic period where we could not do this, but I don't know how personally you are involved or familiar with social networks like Twitter, Instagram, but a lot of people, well, really use that as a tool for connection. And what I'm not sure is whether that was releasing more endorphin or testosterone or adrenaline, because it seems there was a lot of sometimes aggressivity in people. So I don't know. How do you think this type of communication tools, do you think those are equivalent to that grooming or not, or is a completely different world? What do you think?
Oh, I think what this reminds us, probably more than anything else, is how important physical touch is in our relationships with each other, right? In the sense, because we've not been able to do it. And that's what many people have commented was the most frustrating thing. You could see your grandchildren on the screen, but you couldn't hug them. And if you meet somebody in the street, well, the police will arrest you maybe if you have a big hugging session with them. Instead, you just have to wave at them from a distance. And people seem to have found that very, very frustrating. And I think it's because actually we underestimate how important touch is in our everyday relationships all the time, right? We tend to ignore it because we're so dominated by vision and by language. So we meet somebody and we engage them in conversation. But actually, if you watch what happens when people are engaged in conversations with their friends, I mean, we don't do this kind of thing with strangers or people we don't know very well, but with our friends and family, we're constantly hugging them and touching them and stroking them and putting an arm around their shoulder and all this kind of thing all the time. And we did a big survey across the whole of Europe. So this is from Finland in the north down to France in the south. Okay, it's not quite this far down as Spain and Italy, but nearly. And from Britain in the west all the way through to Russia in the east. And also we did it in Japan, so a completely different culture. And we looked at where people were comfortable being touched by other people or touching other people in relation to the quality of the relationship. And the pattern we see is exactly the same. Okay, there were Italians in the sample, because the Italians were quite touchy-feely, a bit more touchy-feely maybe than Northern Europeans, except the Finns were the most touchy-feely people in Europe.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. I thought it would be between Italians or Spaniards, maybe, but no.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, my joke is always, this is what happens if you have saunas.
Okay, maybe, yes, that's warm too.
The British kind of weren't that different, and the Russians, for example, weren't that different to the Finns and the Southern Europeans, the French and the Italians, or to the Japanese, whom we might regard as quite a reserved nationality culturally, right? In the similar way. They were very similar in their overall patterns. And I think this just reflects the fact that we underestimate how important touch is managing and servicing our close relationships. And that, from our data, it looks like that kind of interaction doesn't go much further than about the 50 people closest to you, which are your main group of friends and your main group of family. And that beyond that, everybody, certainly for strangers, everybody, it's hands only, handshakes at a distance. I'm making a concession to allow you to touch me, but I'm keeping you as far away as
certain
possible,
distance,
right?
Yeah.
But the problem with this form of physical contact, basically it's grooming. It's the same actions for most of it, because it's stroking, and it's the stroking that creates this endorphin activation in the brain. The problem is it's something you can't do with two people simultaneously, right? You cannot hug two people at the same time. You can only hug one. And I suggest if you try hugging two people at the same time, or at least even cuddling two people at the same time is better, then one of them is probably likely to become offended because they don't think they're getting enough attention from you. So this is really the limitation of grooming as a bonding mechanism. It's a one-on-one activity. And a key breakthrough occurred when we found ways of increasing, if you like, the size of the grooming huddle beyond just two individuals.
Okay.
And what laughter, singing, dancing, eating together, all these things break through that because you don't have to physically touch the person, but you can still trigger the endorphin system by these activities. And singing is particularly good. It's absolutely magical. You can turn, and we've done experiments on this, you can turn complete strangers into feeling they have known each other from babyhood after just 1 hour of singing together.
Okay. That's very interesting. So we are having here...
Which is why you saw, I mean, they probably did this in Spain, I'm sure, but in Italy during lockdown, they were all standing on their balconies singing together in the street.
We were doing too, yes. We were doing this period of clapping at 8 and meeting and singing. Yes, exactly. So we were finding a way of grooming, despite the distance. Yes, exactly. I think this is what we did during the lockdown. Yes. So we have here already a few questions coming, which I'm gonna read for you. Okay. And one says like, dear Professor Dunbar, couldn't it be argued that the ability to maintain social relationships is a consequence of having a larger brain?
Oh yes, because that's exactly what the mentalizing issue is, right? So we now know that this is also true for monkeys and apes, for other primates, that the mentalizing capacities vary across species of monkeys and apes in ways that correlate with the size of their groups. And the same is true of humans. And that mentalizing circuit, as it's sometimes called, turns out to be massive in the brain. It includes big chunks of brain, particularly in the frontal lobe, but also in the parietal lobe up here on the side of the brain, but also the temporal lobe that runs beside the ear, and below the surface of the brain in the limbic system as well, which we didn't realize until quite recently, I guess. So what's sometimes called the default mode network. That's all part of this social network of neurons in the brain, and the connections between those regions, the white matter connections, the wiring, if you like, are massive, absolutely massive. Now that's taking up a big chunk of the brain. That's why we have such big brains and why primates have such big brains in general. But in addition to that, they're also very costly to maintain, because it turns out that mentalizing, high order mentalizing, which is managing, understanding several people in the same conversation at the same time, is much more neurally expensive. We've shown this with brain scanning studies, much more neurally expensive than trying to think of, understand just the physical things that happen during the course of the story, right? If you separate out the physical events that happen in the story from the things that are going on in the minds of the people in the story, then trying to think through the minds of what's going on in the minds of the people causes you to need much more neural activity than if you're just thinking of the physical things. So, and that's because you're modeling what's going on in the brain rather than just things you can see, if you like, or the brains of other people, modeling what's going on in the brains of other people. So not only is this neural system a very big chunk of the neocortex in particular, but it's also recruited massively in order to manage relationships. And I think this also explains another peculiarity of the social brain data, that actually the relationships get better and better if you exclude those parts of the brain that are just managing bodily systems. So if you exclude the brain stem and a lot of the midbrain, which is just dealing with keeping you alive, and you exclude the visual system at the back of the brain, the relationships between group size and brain size get stronger and stronger and stronger, reflecting this fact that this huge chunk of brain at the front is really crucial for managing relationships. So yes, it's what you're doing, thinking about the relationships, that's important. What takes us back to is something peculiar to primates in the way they manage the social system. It's that they use what psychologists call a dual process mechanism, which means there are two separate neural systems running in parallel. One is the endorphin system, and that's associated with kind of feelings of warmth and contentedness and trustworthiness and so on. And the other is the kind of conscious, and that's going on subconsciously. We kind of, this is why we find difficulty expressing our feelings in language very often, unless you're a poet, of course, who's very skilled at that kind of thing. But the rest of us kind of, we can't express quite what our emotions are, and that's because it's going on below the kind of radar of consciousness, if you like, on the kind of right-hand side of the brain. Whereas the kind of processing of these more conscious level relationships and understanding the relationships and so on, that often involves language, it is operating in parallel to that. It's using a different part of the brain to start with, and the two then are running in parallel. So they reinforce each other, and they're both critical. If you don't have one, you won't have relationships. You have to have both of them there, and this is true for monkeys and apes as it is for us.
Okay. Thank you very much for your response. So
there's another whole lecture there.
Oh, very good. So here we have more. So they say, well, they're asking, because you were mentioning indeed about modern humans in comparison to Neanderthals being the ones that really have the fully modern language. So this says, dear Professor Dunbar, do you know the research about audition in the cima de los huesos hominins as well as in Neanderthals? And if so, do you think that the audition is possibly highly correlated to language?
Yes, no, it is. But the question is that language as we know it in modern humans, right? And this is the point I was making. So if you look at all those markers, and I on that graph, I had 7 different anatomical, essentially anatomical markers of, if you like, vocal capacity and oral capacity. So some of them were about production, it's the ability to control breathing, to have these long exhalations that we need to when we speak. So you don't draw breath, you just keep exhaling, but you kind of conserve your breath in the lungs to be able to do that. Very hard work for the lungs and the body. Some of them are about production of sounds, so they're to do with the management of the space in the upper respiratory tract and the mouth to formulate the sounds used in language. Some of them are about hearing. So they're the bones in the inner ear, for example, and the bandwidth of hearing, the range of sounds that you can hear. All of those change dramatically from a primate-like pattern or size to a modern human-like pattern or size with the appearance of archaic humans, right? So that's the Atapuerca people included. Right? But the question you have to ask at that point is this language, or is this singing without words? Are they kind of chorusing in a humming sort of Stephen Mython sort of way, if you like? So because we do a lot of that, singing is very important for social bonding, and it works amazingly in creating this sense of a community. It's almost instantaneous, and we don't need words for that. Many kinds of song don't have words. We just hum, if you like, or we use nonsense syllables. Of course, we can put words in, so it's perfectly possible. One possibility is that evolved first as a form of chorusing, built off maybe the back of laughter, which has similar kinds of properties, but is kind of organized in a slightly different way, but it's kind of analogous because it's about breath control as much as anything. And then later on, mapped onto that form of chorusing came words to create languages. That's one possibility, and that might have vocals, not vocal singing without words in archaic humans and language appearing in modern humans. Well, we know it must have appeared in modern humans because we have it, right? There's no notion about that. So that's the latest thing. But the alternative is to say, is the possibility that language actually evolved earlier. But if so, language evolved with archaic humans. But if that's the case, then because language is also dependent on mentalizing competencies, not just the production and the hearing, but also how you formulate sentences and words and so on, and how you understand the meaning of sentences, then the language of archaic humans cannot have been as complex as that of modern humans, because their brain anatomy tells us they could not have had the same level of mentalizing competence as fully adult modern humans. They're one notch down. That's still amazingly good. They're still way outside the abilities of monkeys and apes, right? Much, much better. But still not quite in the order of things. And one consequence of that is, as I said at the end, the quality of their stories, the complexity of their stories, and the funniness of their jokes to us would not have been so amusing or interesting. I'm sure there were very funny jokes to Neanderthals, right?
But the thing is,
funny,
I would like to hear those jokes.
funny in the same way that 11-year-old and 12-year-old children think jokes are funny.
It can be very funny.
Funny for adults. They think they're very funny, for adults. So there's a kind of a difference of quantity. It's not a difference of quality, right? We have to be very clear about that. They're still humans. They're still on our side of the fence, if you like. But it's just the difference between being, having a slightly bigger computer to do more calculations. That's the substance.
But the thing is that you were saying a few minutes ago that we are dominated by language and by visual, no? So if I understood correctly, when you correct the human number for Neanderthals, taking into account that they have less frontal development, but we have a larger visual, couldn't be they develop another type? We may be underestimating the visual communication, maybe a different way of communicating with, mimics or facial expression or something that maybe balances this number. You know what I mean? Like a different way of communicating, or we are maybe too narrow thinking of this articulated language we have.
That's an interesting possibility. But what I would say is, this domination is only domination in our minds. It's as we see it, if you like. It's not what's actually happening in the brain. It's just that we are so conscious of the visual system. Now, all primates are highly visual. They're dominated by the visual system. That's just the primate heritage, if you like. Language, once language became sophisticated enough to allow you to convey concepts and so on, which clearly I suspect goes back to the appearance of archaic humans in a serious way. That's the big breakthrough at that point. It might not have been, very complex sentences and very complex ideas they can express, but they still had language, and we would recognize it as language. But the big issue in that context is what you do with language, because if it's purely communication, actually we don't need the words. So we've just published a study done with our collaborators in Madrid. Okay, this is only Madrid, it's not Burgos.
Okay, good.
But what we did was we played, so this was testing an old hypothesis from the 1970s, Mehrabian's conjecture that most of the information in speech actually comes from the sounds we make, not the words. Right. So what we did was we played real life conversations taken from YouTube of either Spanish speakers or English speakers, right? So this is real life conversations. And we asked people who are native English speakers in Britain or native Spanish speakers in Spain to tell us what the quality of the relationship was between the speakers. Were they friendly? Were they unfriendly? If they were friendly, were they best kind of joking with each other, or were they and all they're doing is listening to the thing. They're not seeing the people, they're just listening to it. And we gave them the audio channel as it was. We gave them the audio channel in which the words are disguised, so they can't hear the words any longer. All they can hear is the rise and fall and the intonation. And then we used, the third one was just pure pitch. So it just goes bip, bop, bip, bop, bop, bip, bop, right? There's all they're hearing. And both sets of language people were equally good at telling the quality of the relationship involved, no matter whether they were listening to their own language or the other language,
Okay.
and no matter how good they were at the other language. The bad news is, it was easy to do this with the British because they only spoke English and they were very bad at Spanish. But the Spanish could speak English, or most of them. It was not so, but it was very clear that even without, when you statistically remove the effect of their language knowledge, it didn't really matter. We get almost 90%, 85% of our information comes not about the quality of relationships and what you mean to me when we're having a private conversation comes from how we say things, not what we say.
Exactly. Okay, exactly. Yeah, I know. That's very interesting. And then we give you a final question, and then we let you rest, or I don't know if it is time for a siesta there. There is a last question that says, perhaps the large brain evolved as a response to ecological challenges, which then allow us to find food more efficiently and thus have more time for bonding?
That is certainly possible, because you've got two choices in terms of finding extra time for bonding when you need it. And that is either to change your diet to something where your processing is more efficient. So you're putting into the body more energy and nutrients in the same amount of time, right? So it's the process, digestive efficiency, or you can change something else, like the amount of time you give to travel or resting, a siesta or what have you. You can have a shorter siesta, or of course expand time into the evening as well. Now we know that primates do the first, because that's the big difference between folivorous primates, all of whom live in small, simple groups and have a much less rich social life, and the frugivorous primates like monkeys, baboons, and the macaques, and so on, the Cephidicine monkeys, and all the apes who live in much bigger groups and have a much richer social life. So that shift in diet makes a big difference, and we can show with closely related monkey genera, where you have one that's a folivore and the other that's essentially a frugivore. If you switch the feeding equations around, you just get the other species straight away. You can change a folivorous primate, in colobus monkey, for example, into a frugivorous monkey, colobus monkey living in big groups, because the colobus monkey is particularly interesting because you have these folivorous ones that live in very small groups and the frugivorous ones that live in very big groups. And you can switch populations between these two species very easily by just switching their feeding time equations. It doesn't need any more. And that's simply a consequence of what they're eating. So that's improving your diet efficiency. So meat eating surely has to have been part of that story at some point. When it came in, that's an interesting question. Did it come in with early Homo, for example, and buy them some extra time because it increased nutrient acquisition in efficient ways? That would certainly explain that first uplift. So, the point is there are many ways of playing with your time budgets to try and get these benefits in order to increase group size when you need to. The reason you have to increase group size is ecological. It's to cope with the environment out there. It's not finding food, it's largely predation risk that's driving it. Or in the case of chimpanzees and humans, predators include raiders of your own species, which are sometimes even more problematic. But it's predation risk that's driving most of this in primates. And if you occupy more and more open country habitats, you're exposed to more predators. The only way you can do that is live in big groups. And the argument is that to do that, you have to solve the time budgeting problems, because all species are really living at their limit. The transitions that you see in the course of primate evolution are a consequence of them adjusting usually their diet primarily, or their travel time processes, to create extra time to allow them to increase group size, to allow them to live in more predator risky, open terrestrial habitats. So yes, but I think the big story at the back here is managing relationships. This is really complex. We know this is complicated for primates to do. It's not just a human capacity, and that their mentalizing and other cognitive capacities increase as their group sizes increase. And in fact, they're directly related to these grades that we see in the social brain data.
So thank you very much again for accepting to be with us in our birthday in this CENIEH Distinguished Annual Lecture. For sure was distinguished, was very interesting. It was fascinating. I'm sure I can speak on myself, but probably in the name of many people, we have liberated a lot of endorphins. I don't know if this qualifies as grooming, but we invite you to a proper old-fashioned grooming next year when you can come here and really celebrate with us our birthday again. And it was really very stimulating. I think it is what we really wanted, is to show people how important is science, how many things science can explain of ourselves. I think this is very, very stimulating for all of us. So thank you, Professor Dunbar, for accepting, for sharing with us your knowledge. And thank you, all of you, for attending this lecture and celebrating with us science, and science for a general public is heritage of all of us. And well, yes, I wish you a nice time, a nice year, a lot of social bonding, if possible, to the way the circumstances allows, but I'm sure we will find a way to develop our modern human nature in this sense. And thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to give the lecture, and I look forward with great pleasure to some good Spanish bonding, hopefully next year.
Yes, that's what we will do. We'll see you here next year, and we will celebrate again. Thank you.
Very good.
Ya, estamos.